The bedroom was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong in a house where someone is merely sleeping. July 5th, 1948. Pacific Palisades, California. Morning light filtered through expensive curtains, casting soft golden patterns across a scene that would become one of Hollywood's most carefully buried secrets. She lay there, beautiful even in death. Carole Landis, 29 years old, blonde hair fanned across silk pillows like a halo for a fallen angel. Her skin had turned the color of expensive marble, the kind studios use for their monuments to stars who die too young and too conveniently. On the nightstand, an empty bottle of Seconal. Scattered nearby like evidence at a crime scene no one wanted to investigate. Letters. Something in the air was wrong. Not sorrow, management. The first person to find her wasn't a maid. It wasn't a friend. It was Rex Harrison, the married British actor she'd loved with the kind of desperate passion that consumes women in film noir and destroys them in real life. He stood in that doorway at 9:30 a.m. staring at the woman who had given him everything while he gave her promises as empty as the pill bottle beside her bed. He called his lawyer, not the police, his lawyer. Think about that for a moment. A woman lies dead. The man who finds her doesn't call for help. He calls for protection. By the time authorities arrived, an hour had passed. An hour during which phone calls were made, stories were aligned, and certain materials quietly disappeared from the scene. By lunchtime, reporters were waiting outside the gates. By sunset, the story had been rewritten. Tragedy sells, but scandal destroys. And Hollywood always chooses profit over truth. The headline screamed, "Carole Landis found dead, apparent suicide." Clean, simple. Sad but not complicated. But whispers traveled through the industry's shadows, asking questions that would never appear in print. Why was Harrison there so early with a key to her home? What happened to the second suicide note? The one addressed to him, the one witnesses swore existed before police arrived. Who stood to gain from her silence? The world mourned a beautiful actress gone too soon. Fan magazines published tributes praising her war work and lamenting her troubled love life. But was this really a tragic suicide born of unrequited love? Or was something far more sinister at play? What if the official story was constructed scene by the same industry that had built Carole Landis into a symbol and then discarded her when that symbol lost its market value? Because Hollywood never buries its scandals. It embalms them. It dresses them in sympathetic language, places them in expensive caskets of official narratives, and displays them as cautionary tales. Carole Landis became one such tale. The beautiful girl who loved too much, wanted too much, and paid the ultimate price for not understanding that in Hollywood's golden age, women were currencies, not people. But to understand how it all ended in that bedroom, with pills and letters and a man calling his lawyer instead of an ambulance, we must first understand how it all began. In a place where beauty meant nothing because everyone was too poor to notice. In a childhood that taught her the first of many lessons about escape, that running was survival, and survival meant becoming someone, anyone, other than who you were born to be. She wasn't born Carole Landis. She was born Frances Lillian Mary Ridsty on January 1st, 1919 in Fairchild, Wisconsin, a town so small it barely registered on maps, a place where dreams went to freeze alongside everything else during winter. Her father, Alfred Ridsty, was a railroad mechanic who disappeared from her life before she was old enough to remember his face. Some said he died. Others whispered he simply walked away, the way men did during the Depression when feeding a family became impossible. Her mother, Clara, was left alone with 5 children and the kind of poverty that grinds people down molecule by molecule. They lived in a house that let in cold through walls thin as promises. Frances grew up wearing dresses made from flour sacks, sleeping 3 to a bed with her siblings, watching her mother's hands crack and bleed from washing other people's laundry for pennies. Poverty wasn't just their circumstance, it was their inheritance, passed down like a genetic disease. But even as a child, Frances possessed something that didn't fit in Fairchild, Wisconsin. A face that made people stop mid-sentence and stare. By 12, she looked 18. By 15, she looked like she belonged on magazine covers in cities she'd never seen. Her mother noticed. How could she not? Clara Ridsty had spent her entire life being invisible, poor, plain, exhausted. But her daughter had been given a gift, or a curse. The line between the two has always been thin for beautiful women. Pretty girls end up in two places, Clara warned her daughter during one of those long Wisconsin winters. Church or catastrophe. There's rarely anything in between. Frances would remember those words for the rest of her short life, eventually understanding that her mother had prophesied her entire existence in a single sentence. But at 15, hungry and desperate and beautiful enough to make men twice her age look away in shame at their own thoughts. Frances saw beauty as the only ladder out of generational poverty. School bored her. The future it promised, marriage to a local boy, pregnancy by 17, a life that looked exactly like her mother's, terrified her more than the unknown. So Frances did what desperate, beautiful girls have done since beauty became currency. She lied about her age and married the first boy who offered escape. Irving Wheeler was 19, working at a gas station, dreaming small dreams about eventually managing the place. To Frances, he represented possibility, a chance to leave her mother's house, to sleep in a bed alone, to eat regularly. The marriage lasted barely a year. She discovered quickly that trading one form of poverty for another wasn't freedom. It was just a different cage with a different lock. But that brief failed marriage gave her something invaluable: permission to run. At 16, newly divorced and carrying nothing but hunger and hope and a face that could stop traffic, Frances Ridsty boarded a Greyhound bus to California. Los Angeles, Hollywood, the city where beautiful girls either became stars or disappeared trying, where the distance between triumph and tragedy was sometimes just a studio executive's whim. She had $12 in her pocket, no connections, no training, and absolutely nothing to lose. She kept running, from snow to spotlight, from one hunger to hunger of a different kind. Could a childhood steeped in deprivation and a beauty that arrived too soon have been preparing her for both triumph and destruction? Was she running toward something, or simply fleeing from the poverty that had swallowed her mother whole? Her grandmother before that, every woman in her bloodline who'd been born poor and stayed that way. And when you build your entire identity on escape, what happens when there's nowhere left to run? Hollywood in 1935 was a dream factory operating at maximum capacity, manufacturing fantasies for a depression-ravaged nation that needed to forget their troubles for 90 minutes at a time. Frances arrived wide-eyed and hungry, joining the daily tide of beautiful girls flooding into Los Angeles, each one believing her face was unique, her dreams valid, her chances better than the thousands who'd arrived the month before. The city taught her quickly, thousands of beautiful faces mean beauty becomes worthless. Supply and demand applied to human beings. She started at the bottom. Not the bottom of the film industry, the bottom below that. Frances worked as a singer and dancer in seedy nightclubs where the stages were small and the men's hands wandered and tips were earned through smiles that hid disgust. She posed for photographers who promised connections and delivered exactly nothing. She stood in cattle call auditions with hundreds of other blonde hopefuls, learning that in Hollywood, beautiful girls were interchangeable parts in a machine that consumed them faster than it could produce films. But Frances had learned something crucial from her Wisconsin childhood. Survival required constant reinvention. Frances Ridsty became Frances Westcott, then Patricia Ridsty. Then Frances Ridsty again, trying on names like desperate women try on faces, searching for the combination that would unlock the door. She married again at 17. Another Irving Wheeler, this one a yacht broker, grasping at stability while chasing stardom. That marriage collapsed as quickly as the first. By 19, she'd been married and divorced twice, a fact that would later fuel Hollywood's narrative of her as unlucky in love, as if luck had anything to do with what poverty and desperation make young girls do. The years between 16 and 21 were a blur of auditions, rejections, bit parts so small her name didn't make the credits, and the slow, grinding realization that beauty without connections was just another commodity in oversupply. She was running out of money, running out of hope, running out of youth, the only currency Hollywood truly valued in women. Then came 1940, and a role that would transform her life while setting the template for how Hollywood would use her until there was nothing left to use. Hal Roach was casting for 1 Million BC, a prehistoric adventure requiring a female lead who looked spectacular in animal fur bikinis and could convince audiences she belonged in the Stone Age. The role required no great acting ability, no dramatic range, no talent beyond looking beautiful while running from unconvincing dinosaurs. Frances, now calling herself Carole Landis, a name she chose because it sounded sophisticated, European, unattainable. Because Frances Ridgely wouldn't survive in Hollywood, and she was right. Auditioned wearing an outfit so revealing it made the casting directors uncomfortable in ways they'd later describe as perfect for the part. She got the role. At 21, Carole Landis became a star. Not because of her acting, not because of any particular skill, but because she looked stunning in prehistoric lingerie while screaming at rubber monsters. She named herself Carole Landis because Frances Ridgely wouldn't survive in Hollywood. And she was right. 1 Million BC became a surprise hit. Overnight, Carole's face appeared on magazine covers worldwide. Teenage boys plastered her posters across bedroom walls. She became Hollywood's newest sex symbol, a term that simultaneously elevated and imprisoned her, that opened doors while slamming others shut permanently. Studios saw profit. Directors saw a body. Producers saw a type. Carole saw finally an escape from the poverty that had haunted every woman in her family for generations. But even as flashbulbs exploded in her face and fan mail poured in by the thousands, Carole understood the trap closing around her. She was famous for her body, not her talent. Desired, not respected. The same beauty that had lifted her from Wisconsin poverty was now defining the absolute limits of what Hollywood would allow her to become. She wanted dramatic roles, complex characters, a chance to prove she was more than decoration. The industry wanted her in swimsuits, in fur bikinis, in any outfit that required as little fabric as possible. For the next several years, Carole appeared in film after film. Topper Returns, I Wake Up Screaming, My Gal Sal, comedies, musicals, noir thrillers where she was beautiful, decorative, and ultimately forgettable. Critics praised her looks while dismissing her performances with the kind of casual cruelty reserved for beautiful women who dare want more than being looked at. The industry took her beauty seriously while ignoring everything else she offered. Was the success she achieved truly worth the cost of being seen but never truly recognized? Could anyone escape being typecast when their breakthrough role required them to be nearly naked? And when your entire value rests on physical beauty in an industry that worships youth, what happens when you feel time beginning to steal the only thing that made you valuable? The answer came in the form of a war that would both save her soul and seal her fate. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and suddenly Hollywood's priorities shifted. The nation needed morale. Soldiers needed hope. The industry needed to prove its patriotism. And beautiful women like Carole Landis discovered they could become something more than decoration. They could become symbols. The USO, United Service Organizations, launched entertainment tours to bring Hollywood glamour to military bases overseas. Most stars did one tour, enough for the publicity photographs and the patriotic newspaper coverage. They performed in safe locations, returned home quickly, and added "supports our troops" to their public image. Carole Landis did 5 tours. 5 grueling journeys across North Africa, England, Italy, the South Pacific, war zones where bombs fell and men died, where luxury didn't exist and comfort meant a hot meal and a pretty face, reminding soldiers that somewhere beyond the mud and blood, beauty and normalcy still existed. She traveled with Kay Francis, Mitzi Mayfair, and Martha Ray, 4 women who became known as the 4 Jills in a Jeep. They performed in makeshift theaters and hospital tents on the backs of trucks still warm from combat. Carole sang to wounded soldiers, held hands with dying boys barely old enough to shave, wrote letters home for men whose hands shook too badly from shell shock to hold pens. She contracted malaria in the Pacific and kept performing through fever. She slept in tents, bathed from buckets, ate rations that barely qualified as food. This wasn't publicity. This was Carole Landis discovering, perhaps for the first time in her life, what it meant to give yourself to something that wasn't about being looked at, desired, or consumed. The soldiers adored her, but differently than Hollywood did. They called her Miss Victory, not because of her films, which most of them had never seen, but because she was there. Actually there in the worst places humans can create, bringing something that felt like home to boys who would never see home again. For once, applause didn't come from men wanting her body, but from boys clinging to their lives, thanking her for reminding them what they were fighting for. The same flash that lit up hospital tents would later blind her back in Hollywood. But in those moments overseas, Carole experienced something she'd never known. Being valued for her humanity rather than her measurements, for her courage rather than her curves, for what she gave freely rather than what studios extracted from her. In 1944, the USO tours were dramatized in the film 4 Jills in a Jeep, with Carole playing herself. For once, she wasn't just a pretty face in a forgettable comedy, she was a hero. The film succeeded. Newspapers praised her patriotism. Letters from soldiers and their families arrived by the thousands, thanking her for bringing light to the darkest moments of the war. She had found purpose. She had found meaning beyond beauty. She had found a version of herself that mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with how she looked in a swimsuit. Behind all that glamour and adoration, was there still an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? Could entertaining thousands of men who loved her from a safe distance ever fill the void left by a childhood without genuine affection? And what happens when the war ends, when soldiers return home to real sweethearts, when Miss Victory comes back to Hollywood only to discover that her most meaningful work, the thing that made her feel human, no longer matters to an industry that only ever valued her body? The war ended in 1945. Soldiers came home, America celebrated, Hollywood threw parties, and Carole Landis discovered that heroism has an expiration date. The USO tours that had defined her, that had given her purpose beyond being decorative, they became yesterday's news almost immediately. The industry wanted its stars back in glamorous roles, back in evening gowns and romantic comedies, back to making money instead of making a difference. Carole had spent years being Miss Victory, and now that victory was achieved, Hollywood had no use for that version of her. She tried to transition into serious, dramatic roles. She fought for parts that would prove she'd grown beyond the girl in the fur bikini. But the industry had already decided who Carole Landis was, and transformation wasn't part of her permitted narrative. Beautiful, sexy, increasingly dispensable. By 1946, at 27, ancient by Hollywood starlet standards, Carole could feel her career cooling like coffee left too long on a nightstand. The phone rang less frequently. The roles got smaller. Younger blonde actresses arrived daily, each one a newer model of the same product, each one more willing to accept the terms that Carole was beginning to question. Hollywood loves you when you smile and kills you when you cry. She'd heard that truth whispered in dressing rooms, seen it demonstrated in the careers of women who dared age or demand respect or want something beyond being looked at. Now she was living it, feeling the industry's attention shifting to younger faces while hers, still beautiful, still camera-ready, became increasingly invisible. It was during this slow professional decline, this creeping awareness that her value was depreciating like a car driven off the lot, that she met Rex Harrison. He was everything Hollywood had trained her to want. British, sophisticated, successful, married to German actress Lily Palmer. He possessed the kind of theatrical gravitas and intellectual reputation that Carole desperately wanted to absorb through proximity, as if his legitimacy as a serious actor might somehow transfer to her through association. Rex wasn't just a man. He was the entire system, elegant, entitled, built to take without consequence. They met at a party in 1946. He was charming in that particularly devastating way that British men can be, witty, attentive, making her feel seen not as the girl from 1,000,000 BC or Miss Victory, but as a woman worth knowing for reasons beyond the obvious. He asked about her war work. He seemed impressed by her intelligence. He made her laugh. He made her feel like she mattered. The affair began quietly, conducted in the shadows that Hollywood affairs require when one party is married and both are famous. Rex would call late at night. They'd meet at secluded restaurants, hidden beach houses, anywhere cameras couldn't capture them. He told her what desperate women need to hear, that his marriage to Lily was dead, maintained only for appearances, that he would leave when the timing was right, that what he felt for Carole was real in ways his marriage had never been. She believed him. Not because she was naive, she'd been in Hollywood long enough to know better, but because she needed to believe him. At 28, after 2 failed teenage marriages, after years of being desired but never truly loved, after giving everything to soldiers who went home to other women, Rex Harrison represented something Carole had been running toward her entire life. A love that saw beyond the surface, a relationship built on more than her body, a future that meant something beyond fading beauty and shrinking opportunities. But Rex Harrison was an actor, skilled at making audiences believe whatever the scene required. He had no intention of leaving Lily Palmer. Carole was convenient, beautiful, uncomplicated, grateful for his attention in ways his wife had long stopped being. She was an affair, not an exit strategy, a pleasant distraction, not a serious choice. For nearly 2 years, Carole lived in that liminal space between hope and delusion, between being loved and being used. She attended his film premieres as a friend. She waited for phone calls that came less and less frequently. She watched him perform the role of devoted husband in public while whispering promises of eventual freedom in private. By 1948, the pretense had become unbearable. Carole's career was circling the drain. Her beauty, the only currency she'd ever possessed, was being devalued daily by an industry obsessed with youth. And the man she'd pinned her hopes on, the relationship she'd believed would save her from the loneliness of fading relevance, was revealing itself as one more performance where she was the only one who didn't know it was fiction. She began making demands. She threatened to go public with their affair. She told him she couldn't continue living in shadows, being his secret shame while Lily Palmer got to be his public pride. Rex responded with the oldest line in the cheater's playbook. "I need more time." Did this toxic relationship mark her downfall? Or was it simply the final symptom of a deeper disease that had been eating at Carole since childhood? Could a woman who'd spent her entire life being valued only for her appearance ever find peace in a love that existed only in darkness? And when the man you've sacrificed everything for finally tells you the truth, that you were never really the choice, just the convenient option, what does someone do when there's nowhere left to run? She kept running, from snow to spotlight, from hunger to hunger of a different kind. But by July 1948, Carole Landis had finally run out of places to escape to. July 4th, 1948, Independence Day. The irony would not be lost on those who later studied the timeline of her final hours. Carole had invited Rex to her home in Pacific Palisades, a beautiful house she could barely afford, purchased during better times when her career still seemed salvageable, when she still believed beauty and fame would be enough. She'd planned the evening with the kind of desperate precision that marks last chances. A quiet dinner, a serious conversation, an ultimatum she'd rehearsed until the words felt almost powerful enough to change reality. She was 29 years old. Her career was dying. Her body, the thing Hollywood had valued above everything else about her, was aging out of the industry's narrow standards of marketability. This was her last chance, for love, for security, for a life that meant something beyond slowly fading into obscurity. Rex arrived. They talked. For once, he didn't offer reassurances or promises or requests for more time. For once, Rex Harrison told Carole Landis the truth. He wasn't leaving Lily. He couldn't. The scandal would destroy his career. British audiences wouldn't forgive a man who abandoned his wife for a Hollywood starlet. Lily had made it clear she would divorce him publicly, messily, destroying his carefully cultivated reputation as a sophisticated gentleman. He'd lose film opportunities, theatrical roles, the respect that defined his professional identity. He was sorry. He cared about Carole, but she had to understand his marriage, his reputation, his career came first. They always had. She'd just been too desperate to see it. What Carole heard was simpler, more devastating, and completely accurate. You're not worth the cost. After Rex left that night, Carole sat alone in her beautiful house, surrounded by photographs of herself entertaining soldiers who were now home with their sweethearts. Magazine covers proclaiming a fame that was already fading. Awards from a war that Hollywood had already forgotten. The silence was complete, the kind of silence that only exists when there's nobody coming, nobody calling, nobody who needs you to be anything anymore. She wrote letters, one to her mother full of apologies for not escaping poverty successfully enough, for wasting the gift of beauty, for dying without leaving anything behind worth remembering. One to Rex Harrison. Words that would haunt anyone cruel enough to read them. You have broken my heart, but I love you still. Goodbye, my darling. There were two letters. There are always two, one for the mother, one for the man. Only one made it into the official record. Then Carole Landis took what Hollywood studio doctors had been prescribing to keep their stars beautiful and compliant. Seconal, the barbiturate that promised sleep without dreams and delivered death without struggle. She took enough to ensure she'd never wake up to another phone call that didn't come. Another audition for a role she wouldn't get. Another night alone realizing that everything she'd run from had been chasing her all along. Whether she intended suicide or simply intended to sleep through the pain forever remains a question that died with her. But intention matters less than result, and the result was the same. Carole Landis, Miss Victory, the girl from Wisconsin who'd escaped poverty only to discover that Hollywood offered a different kind of starvation, was gone. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or was Carole's entire life a series of desperate flights, from poverty to Hollywood, from obscurity to fame, from one doomed relationship to the next, always running but never arriving anywhere that felt like safety? The morning of July 5th, 1948, Rex Harrison used his key, the key he'd claimed to have for emergencies, to enter Carole's home. He claimed later that he'd come to check on her after their difficult conversation the night before, that he'd been worried about her emotional state, that he'd feared she might do something rash. He found her in the bedroom, dead for hours, her skin cold, the pills long dissolved into a bloodstream that had stopped moving. And then Rex Harrison did something that reveals more than any suicide note ever could about power, privilege, and who gets protected in Hollywood's machinery. He doesn't call the police, not immediately. He lights a cigarette instead. Smoke rises. The silence in that room becomes a verdict. He called his lawyer. He called his agent. The official timeline suggests at least an hour passed, possibly longer, between Rex discovering Carole's body and authorities being notified. An hour during which phone calls were made, stories were coordinated, and according to multiple witnesses who would later speak only off the record, certain materials were removed from the scene. By the time police arrived, the narrative was already constructed. A tragic suicide, an emotionally unstable actress, unrequited love. The note to her mother remained appropriately sad and vague. The note to Rex Harrison, the one that allegedly detailed their affair, his promises, his betrayals, had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The studio already had a statement drafted. By noon, she was no longer a woman. She was a liability, an image to be managed. Silence did the rest. The inquest was brief. The conclusion foregone, suicide while of unsound mind. No criminal investigation, no questions about why a married man had a key to the deceased's home, or why he'd called his lawyer before emergency services. No inquiry into missing evidence or suspicious timelines. Hollywood's machinery of protection, studio fixers, cooperative police, compliant press, operated with the efficiency of long practice. Rex Harrison released a carefully worded statement expressing shock and sadness at the loss of a dear friend. Language so precisely neutral it could mean everything or nothing. Lily Palmer stood by her husband, either genuinely unaware of his infidelity or calculating that maintaining her marriage was worth swallowing the truth. Within months, Rex was back at work, his career untouched by scandal. By 1956, he'd win a Tony. In 1964, an Oscar for My Fair Lady. In 1989, he was knighted by the Queen. He died in 1990, wealthy and celebrated, having lived long enough to accumulate every honor the entertainment industry could bestow. He never publicly spoke Carole's name again. Not in interviews, not in his autobiography. Not even when directly asked about the beautiful actress who died mysteriously the same night he'd ended their affair. Silence, Rex Harrison understood, was the privilege of the powerful. The funeral was held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park on July 9, 1948. A modest service, surprisingly small considering Carole had once been famous enough to draw crowds. Her mother was there, Clara Ridsty, aged and broken by a lifetime of poverty that even her daughter's brief success hadn't been able to lift. A few loyal friends attended, women who'd known Carole before fame, who remembered Frances from Wisconsin. Some soldiers came, men she'd entertained during the war, who still remembered Miss Victory with the kind of reverence reserved for people who'd given them hope, when hope was the only weapon that mattered. They wore their uniforms, medals pinned to chests, and they wept for the woman who'd made them feel human when the world was trying to turn them into killers. The studio sent flowers, large, expensive arrangements with cards expressing deepest sympathies, the kind of gesture that costs money but requires no actual feeling. No studio executives attended, no major stars. The industry Carole had given everything to couldn't be bothered to show up for her funeral. The men who risked their lives for freedom remembered her. The man she died for remembered silence. Were those final days an act of surrender, or a courageous act of self-preservation? Choosing the terms of her own ending rather than slowly fading into obscurity and poverty like her mother before her? Could a woman with no power in Hollywood's patriarchal system ever truly escape the men who used and discarded her? Or was death itself the only escape left to women who'd been valued for beauty and then aged out of relevance? Carole Landis was buried in a simple grave at Forest Lawn, marked by a stone listing only her stage name and dates. No mention of Miss Victory. No recognition of the 5 USO tours or the thousands of soldiers she'd entertained. No acknowledgement that she'd given more to the war effort than nearly any other Hollywood star. The epitaph might as well have read, "She was beautiful, and then she wasn't, and then she didn't matter anymore." In the immediate aftermath, Hollywood treated Carole's death exactly as it treated all inconvenient truths about its treatment of women, as a cautionary tale about emotionally unstable actresses, rather than asking harder questions about an industry built on consuming female beauty and discarding the women once consumed. Fan magazines published articles warning young starlets about falling too hard for unavailable men, as if the problem was Carole's feelings rather than Rex Harrison's lies, as if loving someone was the crime rather than using someone's love as a disposable convenience. The story was buried quickly. Hollywood moved on. Rex Harrison's career flourished. Lily Palmer remained Mrs. Harrison for years, publicly playing the role of devoted wife while privately knowing her husband had been there when another woman died. And Carole became a footnote, the actress who killed herself over unrequited love, reduced to a warning label about the dangers of wanting too much. But over the decades, something shifted. Researchers began asking questions. Feminists started examining the patterns. Film historians noticed that Carole's story wasn't unique. It was symptomatic of something larger, darker, more systemic. What happened to that second suicide note? Why was Rex Harrison, a married man, allowed unsupervised access to a crime scene? Who benefited from keeping the affair quiet? And why did Hollywood's machinery move so quickly to protect a man while blaming a dead woman for her own destruction? The answers pointed to a pattern repeated so often it became invisible. Powerful men being protected while the women they used were blamed, shamed, and forgotten. Carole wasn't an isolated tragedy. She was part of a production line. Jean Harlow, dead at 26. Barbara Payton, dead homeless and alcoholic after being discarded by the industry. Marilyn Monroe, 14 years after Carole, also found dead with pills scattered and powerful men's stories not quite adding up. These women were called tragic by a culture that refused to admit it had systematically created the conditions for their destruction. They were products of a system that valued them only as beautiful objects, then acted surprised when objectification killed them. They were currencies in a market that determined their worth based on measurements in youth, then discarded them when those assets depreciated. They were human beings treated as renewable resources by an industry that manufactured glamour from their consumption. But Carole's legacy isn't only tragedy, it's also testament. The soldiers never forgot her. For decades after her death, veterans placed flowers on her grave at Forest Lawn. They wrote letters to newspapers defending her memory. They insisted to anyone who would listen that Carole Landis was a hero who deserved better than Hollywood gave her. Better than Rex Harrison used her for, better than history tried to reduce her to. In recent years, museums dedicated to World War II history have begun including Carole among the civilians who contributed to victory. Feminist film scholars have reclaimed her story, examining how the studio system failed her while pretending to celebrate her. She's become a symbol of Hollywood's golden age, not the glamorous symbol the studios wanted, but the dark truth of what that glamour cost the women who generated it. Truth costs more than beauty. Was her death as straightforward as reported? Or were powerful forces involved, men who couldn't afford scandal, studios that couldn't afford questions, and an industry built on silencing women who threatened to expose its exploitation? The official record says Carole Landis killed herself because of a broken heart. But hearts don't break in isolation. They break under accumulated weight, rejection after rejection, exploitation after exploitation, being valued only for the parts of yourself that age and depreciate, being loved only as long as you remain useful, being discarded the moment you demand to be treated as human rather than currency. She wasn't killed by Rex Harrison's rejection alone. She was killed by a childhood that taught her beauty was her only value. She was killed by an industry that used her body while denying her humanity. She was killed by a system that protected powerful men while blaming vulnerable women for their own destruction. She was killed by the same forces that killed Jean Harlow, that killed Marilyn Monroe, that kill women still. The machinery that turns beauty into profit and then disposes of the women once their beauty depreciates. She wasn't weak, she was exhausted. There's a difference. She survived one war and died in another. The soldiers she entertained in hospital tents returned home to build families, careers, futures. The woman who'd given them hope when hope mattered most died alone in a house she couldn't afford. Killed by a love affair with a man who valued his career more than her life. Some nights, the old veterans say, the ones who still remember a blonde woman singing to them in makeshift theaters, making them believe in something worth surviving for. Some nights they swear they can still hear her voice. Not from old film reels, but from somewhere deeper. Somewhere Hollywood's machinery could never quite reach or control or silence completely. She was Frances Ridstey from Wisconsin, daughter of poverty and abandonment. She was Carole Landis, the name she chose because Frances wouldn't survive in Hollywood. And she was right. She was Miss Victory to soldiers who remembered her with reverence. She was Rex Harrison's secret shame, the woman he used and discarded and never spoke of again. She was all of these things, and none of them captured who she truly was beneath the projections. Maybe that's the real tragedy. She escaped every cage but the one built from other people's eyes. The grave at Forest Lawn still receives flowers. Fresh ones even now, more than 70 years after she died. Someone remembers. Someone refuses to let her be forgotten. Someone understands that Carole Landis deserves better than being remembered as a cautionary tale or a footnote in Rex Harrison's glittering biography. She deserves to be remembered as Frances from Wisconsin, Carole of Hollywood. Miss Victory to soldiers and no one to herself. A woman who survived poverty by becoming beautiful, who survived obscurity by becoming famous, who survived war by giving hope to others, but couldn't survive an industry that valued her only as long as she remained young, desirable, and silent about the cost. Hollywood loves you when you smile and kills you when you cry. Carole Landis smiled for the cameras, for the soldiers, for Rex Harrison, even as he was destroying her. When she finally allowed herself to cry, when she finally demanded to be valued as something more than decoration, the industry that had profited from her beauty turned away. They let her slip into darkness without witness, without justice, without truth. The official story was written by men protecting men. But truth has a way of surviving burial, of outlasting the carefully constructed narratives designed to hide it. The truth is this. Carole Landis didn't die of unrequited love. She died of a system that breaks women methodically, then blames them for shattering. And somewhere in Wisconsin, in the frozen poverty that birthed Frances Ridstey, in the railroad towns and Depression-era desperation that taught a child beauty was power and nothing else mattered, somewhere in that origin story lies the seed of everything that followed. Not that she died, but that she was never allowed to live as anything other than what others projected onto her. Hollywood's lights still shine, but they never reach her grave. The question isn't whether we'll remember Carole Landis. The question is whether we'll finally see her, not as the girl in the fur bikini, not as Miss Victory, not as Rex Harrison's tragic mistress, but as a human being who deserved better than a world that made her beauty both her fortune and her death sentence. Her last words vanished, as so many women's do, edited for someone else's comfort. Until we can answer that question honestly, until we can acknowledge the machinery that consumed her and the system that protected her consumers, her ghost will continue haunting Hollywood's golden facade. A reminder that behind every beautiful smile captured on film, there might be a woman drowning in darkness, waiting for someone, anyone, to see her before she disappears completely. Hollywood builds angels just to break their wings. The curtains are still drawn on Capri Drive. Inside, the air still smells faintly of perfume and morphine. Hollywood called it suicide. But every woman who's been used and forgotten knows what really killed her. She won every heart but her own war.